This lecture is entitled Placing People in a Global Context, a Regional Approach to Comparative Cultural Studies, and is the first in the general lecture series. Why study geography? Well, no place on the planet can exist in isolation. So as students, you need to be exposed to concepts to be responsible world citizens through globalization. Every place and every person on the planet is interconnected in some way or another. And of course, to complete this course, this will ensure that you never find yourself not knowing where news is taking place. Geography is a study of place and space. It studies the location and distribution of features on the Earth's surface, as well as human activity, the natural environment, and the relationship between the two. There is a strong correlation between human activity and our physical environment. There's actually no place on the planet where humans have not touched. We seek to answer actually three questions with a fourth that may or may not be important. Those questions are: what is it, where is it, and why is it there? For example, why is Montgomery, Alabama where it is? Why is it situated where it is? And historically, what was the decision-making process to put it there? Why did the settlement evolve on this site? Clearly, in the historical context, Montgomery was located along the river, and river traffic was the way to transport goods and services at that time. It's divided, geography, into two major divisions: physical geography, which includes study of the natural environmental processes across the Earth's surface. It looks at fluvial geomorphology, climatology, mountain building, plate tectonics, those sort of things. Cultural or human geography studies the distribution of people across the planet and why they're located where they did, their cultures, their politics, urban change. Also studies the human-land interaction. So geography is both a physical and a social or human science, and you'll find geography departments in a variety of schools and colleges across the nation at universities. These two slides show specializations in geography. So like other disciplines, there are many ways to specialize, and these are a few. Same thing, same slide. I would say that subdisciplines aren't really a correct description of these. These are areas of specialization. Geographers claim there are 7 ideas that changed the world. One is construction of maps. The early Greeks made maps. So maps have been around a long time among human activities. Human adaptation to the environment goes back to the very beginnings of us as a species on the planet. Humans also modify the Earth. The Earth can be read through its cultural landscape. Carl Sauer, the founder of the Berkeley School of Geography, is the first person to coin this term, and we will talk about that later on. Cultural landscape includes settlement patterns, which would be the arrangement of buildings, roads, and cities across the physical landscape. Land division patterns are part of the cultural landscape and can tell you something about who lived there, or at least who discovered those places. French long lots, for example, exist in New Orleans, Louisiana, as well as along the Mississippi River. The French first deeded land to a landowner, and their inheritance says that each descendant gets a piece of property. So long lots end up, as in New Orleans, where the city blocks follow them, to have very narrow frontage and deep lines. So you'll find a French long lot that may be 200 feet across and a mile deep. Meets and bounds is an English sort of survey system, no longer exists. It's in the eastern part of the United States, the first states to be occupied. It uses as boundary markers trees and rocks. And as we know, trees and rocks may or may not survive the years. Public land survey was instituted by the government later on in our early history, and it's grid-like and includes what we call township and range. We use that today in most states. Architecture is a part of the cultural landscape, especially vernacular architecture. So if you've ever seen a shotgun house, they exist in downtown Montgomery, that's a piece of vernacular architecture. The difference between vernacular architecture and professionally designed architecture is that vernacular architecture exists in the minds of the folks who construct those buildings and can tell us a little bit about their heritage and where they're from. For example, the shotgun house, it first came to the United States from Africa. And there are other sorts of constructed homes that exist in Alabama as well that represent vernacular architecture. It's the earliest form of architecture. Vernacular architecture uses local materials for building. The sense of place. Place is scaled, so it could be the room you're in, it could be the house you're in, it could be the subdivision you're in, the city you're in, the country you're in. And it's defined by cultural and physical elements that make up that place as a memorable area to visit. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Spatial organization and interdependence involves the relationship between places on the physical landscape. Cities especially are interdependent with each other for goods and services. Central place theory is a theory developed by Walter Christaller. I call it a model, not as much as a theory. And it was based on the early German landscape, which was flat and featureless, and has in it this notion that there are tiered sorts of cities, some huge central places that provide all goods and services that anybody could need. Then there are lower order places that surround central places in octagonal patterns, and then even lower order towns that surround second order places in hexagonal patterns as well. The problem is that Christaller did this on a flat featureless plane, and friction, which would be mountains, rivers, political boundaries, have an impact on that hexagonal pattern. But it's still a good concept to learn about and understand today. And then the last one is megalopolis, which is this notion that urban spaces grow toward each other, ultimately become enveloped in this paved mass of cities. Boss Wash is a megalopolis. That is an area from Boston to Washington, D.C., where basically you could drive that entire distance and never run out of an urban sort of environment. There are a couple different geographic approaches. Two of them are regional, which selects a portion of the Earth's surface, then focuses on the environment, people, and activities within the area. The second one is topical. That's what you're actually going to deal with in this course. Identifies a set of important cultural issues to be studied, such as population growth, political disputes, economic restructuring, blah, blah, blah. You are going to end up studying world regions on a topical or thematic basis. There are several methods of geographical analysis. Descriptive, which emphasizes a collection of a variety of details, features about a particular location. It's used primarily by regional geographers to illustrate the uniqueness of a particular location, and then in fact study its diversity from other locations. Systematic emphasizes the identification of several basic theories or techniques developed by geographers to explain the distribution of activities It employs the scientific method in search of overarching laws. So it's nomothetic. So systematic is very, very keyed in to statistical analysis and other ways to quantify, if you will, through population growth, gross per capita income, all those things that are measurable and mathematical quantifiable. There are several levels of geographic data. Primary geographic data is information collected directly by you if you are the researcher through surveys, interviews, observations, ever how you can collect information about a place. Secondary geographic data is obtained indirectly from others. So that could be census data, it could be reading ethnographic works about some traveler that traveled to a foreign place and noted its culture, its foods, its geography, its habits and customs. Spatial information has a geographic or a locational component. It includes data with geographic coordinates, and that can be associated with two of the coordinate systems we use today, which would be universal transverse Mercator or latitude and longitude, which was first developed by the Greeks. There are some core geographic themes. Pattison published this in 1964. It's still sort of a read for everybody that studies geography. I believe I made it available to you. He called it the four traditions. Spatial tradition, which deals with location. Aerial studies, also known as chorography or regional studies. Man-land. It's not environmental determinism, it's human-environment relationships. What's environmental determinism? It's the notion, very unpopular today, that environment determines culture. So environment determines how humans have to live on a particular area. To an extent, it is true, but its deterministic qualities have been watered down, so to speak. Earth science is the study of the earth, the water, the atmosphere, and association between the earth and the sun. I would say climatology would probably be the most widely known of the earth sciences that geographers become involved with. Physical geography basically is geology without the mineralogy component to it. I'm not going to say anything about this slide. You can read the captions. A note about geographic location. Position of anything on the Earth's surface can be described in two ways. One is absolute. That's precise. That includes a latitude and a longitude. The second is relative. You can speak about a location of a place relative to other places. For example, Montgomery is south of Birmingham. Birmingham is west of Atlanta. Place and space, two concepts that are constantly discussed and talked about. Place is a point or area on the Earth's surface having a geographic character defined by what it looks like, what people do there, and how they feel about it. So what it looks like can be a lot of different conditions. What people do there could be a lot of different activities, and how they feel about it is extremely individual. So when we talk about place, we talk about your interpretation of the point or area you're standing on the Earth's surface, whether inside a building, outside a building, or whatever. Space is a physical gap or interval between two objects. This is constantly debated. So it's often indistinguishable from other space. It has no characteristics other than location and its size, and really you have no impression of that particular area that would actually render it a place. Once traits are given to space, it transforms into a place. My favorite saying is all space is someone's place. So I would be very guarded about defining any point on the planet space, at least the ones that we occupy. Here's the nature of place. They have location, direction, and distance with respect to other places. So they have absolute locations. They have size. They may be large or small. Could be your room in your house, or could be a city. Has both physical and cultural content. The attributes of place develop and change over time. So it's basically a fluid term. It depends on, if it's a classroom, all the people that are in the classroom come together, a culture is formed for that period of time, and that becomes a particular place. The elements of places interrelate to other places. So, Montgomery as a place is interrelated to Birmingham. There are goods and perhaps services that you can't get in Montgomery that you could get. You'd have to go to Birmingham to get them, or at least have someone from Birmingham come here to accomplish whatever it is you needed to be accomplished. Content of places is rationally structured, meaning that it's kind of like culture in that nothing exists without a function, and that function serves to uh, render the whole successful. So the content of places is rationally structured. It serves the place. Places may be generalized into regions of similarities and differences. So that's where we're getting to what we're going to study, which is world regional geography. There are some elements of direction that we have to understand. Direction is a universal geographic concept. It has more than a single meaning. It can be expressed in two ways. It could be absolute, expressed on cardinal points, north, south, east, and west, or it could be relative again. Distance is a measurement of the physical space between two places for geographers. Can be expressed in at least two ways. Absolute, once again, so measured by some accepted standard, or relative. Scale is something you need to understand. In maps, the relationship between the proportion of Earth being studied and the Earth as a whole is represented by scale. So if you look at a map that has a scale on it, that scale indicates the distance between 2 points on the Earth's surface relative to that piece of paper. It can be stated several ways. Verbal, 1 inch represents 10 miles, just stated. Graphic, oftentimes a map will have this, and if you look at that particular graphic scale, the 0 to 1 indicates 1 kilometer, and it's divided into 4 subsections. And then we go to 2 kilometers and 3 kilometers. Representative fraction is the most versatile, meaning that 1 unit of anything you measure on the paper surface is equal to 50,000 of the same unit in the real world. So you could have a yardstick or ruler and measure 1 inch, and that would equal 50,000 inches in the real world. Or you could measure 1 centimeter, and that would be 50,000 centimeters in the world. Two notions about scale. Large scale represents a small portion of the Earth's surface, provides more detail. Small scale is a large portion of the Earth's surface, less detail. So if you're looking at a world map, you're not getting the detail that you might need. How do we determine whether it's large or small? Divide the number to the left of the colon by the number to the right of the colon. If it's a large number, it's a large scale map. If it's a small number, it's a small scale map. In regional or topical studies, scale has to do with how close in you're examining a place in that particular region. There are 5 organizing themes in world regional geography. The first is environment, that's a physical and social term. The second is population and settlement. The third is cultural coherence and diversity. The fourth is geopolitics. And the fifth is environment and social development. So your textbook is divided up this way. The first chapter discusses the organizing themes in regional geography, among other things. The second chapter studies a little bit about physical environment so you can understand some of the terms we use later in the chapter. And then the final chapters discuss each of the world regions. What's a region? It's a spatial category. It could be physical or cultural. It's sort of a spatial stereotype, if you will. So it's describing a bunch of folks by a few different characteristics. It has a core and a periphery. The core is the center, the periphery is the outside of the center. There is distance decay from the core, meaning that the traits you're studying are most dense in the core area and least dense as you move away from that core area until they don't exist anymore. It has artificial, fuzzy, fluid boundaries, unless it's a lake, unless it's a physical feature. So fuzzy boundaries, what does that mean? It means that I've driven to Mexico several times from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The closer I get to the border of Texas and Mexico, the more Spanish signs I see, the more Spanish that is spoken. The further into Mexico I get from the United States, the less English is spoken. It's a fuzzy boundary. So I can plan on, if I want, to speak Spanish the minute I get to Houston and all the way to the border. I can plan to speak English from the border south about 50 to 70 kilometers. After that, it has to be Spanish all the way. There are three regional types, a formal, a functional, and a vernacular. We'll go over them now. A formal region is a region that's made up by physical and cultural characteristics that the researcher has in mind and they want to study. So a formal region has characteristics that either the researcher defined in the beginning and then looked for their existence in the geography, or went into the geography and identified those particular characteristics. When they fall off and exist no more, that's the boundary of the region. A functional region functions either politically, socially, or economically. So the state of Alabama is a political, functional region. It has clear boundaries, and they always have a node. So a functional region has nodes. The node is the center or controlling area of that functional region. So the node for the state of Alabama is Montgomery, Alabama. Okay? A vernacular region exists in the minds of the folks who believe they inhabit that area. Dixie is a classic example of a vernacular region. How do we define those, or how do we even come up with those? Well, we would look through phone books, look at business names, and business names that include reference to the South, for example, like Great Southern Plumbing and Heating, or Southern Air Conditioning, or Dixie Electric, would indicate that there's this consciousness, their idea of a sense of South and Dixie. So when that exists no more in the businesses and on the minds of those who inhabit that area, that vernacular region doesn't exist anymore. The vernacular regions are kind of disappearing, but Midwest still is a vernacular region. Northeast is a vernacular region. Iron Belt or Rust Belt is a vernacular region. And if you ask those people that live there if they feel a sense of living in the Rust Belt or the Midwest, they'll say yes. Let's look at the environment. What do we look at when we investigate the physical environment? The physical environment includes landforms, hydrology, soils, and climate. So those are the things we look at. The human environment involves social factors such as economics, culture, demography, and migration, and political factors. And I believe the next slide will go through these. Agricultural potential. We would look at the landscape in terms of agricultural potential. Tropical forests, for example, have poor soils, the poorest soils on the planet, and would have less agricultural potential. Savannas or grasslands are better for agriculture, and of course, deserts are deserts. The map to the right is a map that shows climate areas or regions, and then average rainfall and average temperature for the 12 months of the year in the little insets. Human environment interaction. It's a complex relationship. It involves nature and its impact on human activity, human impact on the environment, and is there a possibility of a balanced relationship with nature? These are areas that suffer some sort of stress on the map to the right, and water stress is a big issue today. The limited availability of fresh water across the planet. So there are a lot of areas that are under water stress, many of them not desert areas. It's the comparative analysis of the interaction between the various groups and their environments. Some groups are more environmentally conscious than others. Cultural landscape. Cultural landscapes are visible material expressions of human activity and settlement, past and present. They evidence what we call areal differentiation, explaining the differences that set off one place and make it distinct from others. Areal integration is how different places interact with one another, those who don't have a particular resource that others either plant or have. These two illustrations show different cultural landscapes. The top one is a landscape of agriculture, traditional sorts of agriculture, terraced lands, plants growing green, green, green. The bottom one is inhabited by pastoralists. They're the Maasai of sub-Saharan Africa. Pastoralists raise cattle or sheep, some sort of herding animal. So they only produce proteins, milk, meat, cheese, and blood. Agriculturalists produce carbohydrates. So pastoralists have to interact with agriculturalists in certain areas. These are cultural landscapes. If you looked at these two landscapes, you should be able to say something about even the society that these folks inhabit, their culture, and the kind of worldview that these people will have. Globalization in places. Globalization is the increasing interconnectedness economically of places and people around the planet. There's a fear, and that's why we study regional geography and diversity, that this sense of uniqueness, the diversity of all cultures on the planet, is being eroded away into a homogeneous landscape of globalization. We do know that the humans on the planet are urbanizing at a rapid rate. And by the end of this century, A full 75 to 80% of the planet will be living in urban spaces. If I go to Mexico City, the urban landscape looks almost the same as New York City, including all of the fast food. So that's homogenization. Within the last 100 years, probably 600 to 1,000 languages have disappeared on the planet. Many people speak English today. I doubt that there are any political entities, um, some 400 of them today, who would abandon their national language. But there are more people speaking English today than ever. It's the universal lingua franca. Language carries culture. So ideas are being transmitted, and we all, as a global society, are beginning to think about our planet in the same way, most especially with respect to the environment and sustainability. You can watch the videos um, as you go through this on your own. I'm not going to say anything about this. We talked about it before, other than to say micro to macro. Micro is a local, macro is a global, and regional somewhere in between in those scales. Let's look at population and settlement. Those concerns include population size and population distribution. As you can see from these maps, population is clustered in certain areas and distributed, not necessarily totally clustered together in a country. But if you look at China below, you can see that most of the population is clustered to the eastern portion of China, the coastline back alongside rivers. Elements that we want to look at as regional geographers are population growth and change. How fast is population growing? What are the demographics of it? Impact of variations in family planning, in migration. As we all know, China, not too terribly long ago, had a one-child rule, so population growth was quite slow in China. That's catching on elsewhere across the planet, not in terms of law, but in terms of an economic decision of 1 to 2 children is economically about sufficient for anyone's wallet. How do we quantify population growth and change? First thing we look at is rate of return, or I'm sorry, rate of natural increase. That's a percentage of increase or decrease equal to the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate expressed as a percentage. These are older numbers, but it hasn't changed that much. Crude birth rate of the world is 23 per 1,000, and the crude death rate is 9 per 1,000. So crude birth rate 23 minus crude death rate 9 equals an increase of 14 per 1,000, or 1.4% per year. Total fertility rate acts on crude death rate in some ways. Total fertility rate is the average number of children born by a statistically average woman during her reproductive years. 1990s, global was 2.9 children. In the US, it was 2.0, and Europe was 1.4. So as we can see, it's lower in what we would term as developed nations, nations that have gone through a demographic change. And then we look at percentage of the population under 15 years of age, 19% in developed countries, US is 22%. Percentage of population under 15 years of age is important because 15 years of age is globally, culturally, and physically. I know you can have children earlier than that. That is the culturally and physically accepted general age where humans enter into the reproductive cycle. and it has to do with how many children are going to be born in a society. Total fertility rate is adjusted, usually based uh, on infant mortality rates. So if you are studying an area on the planet where there's high infant mortality rates, you're going to find high total fertility rates, the number of children born by statistically average women in their reproductive years. Why is that? Well, if your children are dying before the age of 5 at a rapid rate, you're going to have more children in order that one or two of them grows into adulthood. I call it the rule of fish. Fish have lots of babies. Why? Because all those little fish get eaten, most of them, and very few of them survive into adulthood. The same rule applies in humans. So there are parts of the planet where total fertility rates run into the nines and tens. So women have 9 babies and maybe one of them survives into adulthood. The demographic transition was first used to describe modernization, not modernization, but industrialization. So you can see what happens to total population as countries move through the Industrial Revolution. Now we use it for modernization. So at stage 1 on the left, there's a high birth rate and a high death rate with a low rate of natural increase, which is total population growth, the red line. Stage 2 is a transitional stage where medical care becomes better, longevity might increase a little bit, death rate declines, birth rate remains stable. So what happens if the birth rate is high and the death rate declines? You're going to experience rapid population growth. So you can notice the red line is spiraling upward, high rate of natural increase. Stage 3, the death rate is low, bottoms out. Healthcare is better, people are living longer, better nutrition, all of that. Birth rate begins to decline too, so rate of natural increase slows down. And finally, in stage 4, death rate's low, birth rate's low, and you have a low rate of natural increase. So from birth rate, death rate high, birth rate, death rate low, population stabilizes. The problem is those transitional stages, phase 2 and phase 3. What happens to cause birth rate to go down? Generally, contraceptive use, increased economic benefits that the populace is dealing with. They understand they don't need to have a lot of children for them to reach adulthood, and they finally drop the birth rate, lower their birth rates. There are 3 population pyramids at the lower right. One has a high percentage male-female, so male is purple, female is greenish, below the age of 15 in the first one. And in that particular situation, that's Kenya. In the next 15 to 20 years, they're going to experience a population explosion with that kind of a population pyramid. That's rapid growth. And what happens if a country can't feed its own and is experiencing a high percentage of the population below the age of 15? They're going to run into problems in the next 15 to 20 years. The United States, you can see the bottom of the pyramid is pretty level. That's slow growth. Zero growth is Denmark to the right, where actually the population pyramid is compressed at the bottom. Population pyramids can tell you a lot about what's happening in a particular place. Here's some more population demographics that are extended out from 2000 to 2025 to 2050. You're welcome to take a look at them. You can see what's happened in Mexico. Mexico's part of Latin America. Latin America, over the past 20 to 25 years, has slowed its rate of natural increase in total fertility rates and birth rates dramatically. However, the relationship between culture and population is quite interesting. Has to do with religion. So some of the highest population growth countries on the planet are Roman Catholic. Migration is a cause of population growth in some countries. So pull factors are conditions that are favorable in a destination. We have a lot of pull factors influencing illegal migration into the United States that we have to deal with. Immigrants can come into the United States and earn more in an 8-hour day than they could earn in a month in their countries of origin. So economic growth. Most of them repatriate a lot of that income back to their families. So they leave their families and come to the United States. Push factors are negative conditions at an origin that cause emigration. And most of that is war refugees that move into bordering countries. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is population explosions in countries who seem to have control of everything except population. So they have rising populations who can't find jobs, who need to be taken care of. This is a slide that shows West African slave trade. This is forced migration from 1500 until 1870. There were an estimated 13 million people that were moved from West Africa into the New World. It undermines the demographic and social cohesion of society in West Africa for a long period of time. And note where a lot of those forced migrants ended up: South America, Brazil. I would also suggest that you do a little research on the colonial power and how those people were accepted into society after emancipation. It has a story to tell. There is a story to tell. Settlement patterns and land use. That's the way humans displace themselves across the Earth's surface. They vary from region to region, and like art and material culture, reflect what is significant in a society. So we can look at social organization, economic structures, cultural values, political systems, family, kinship, all have something to do with settlement patterns and land use. Urbanization. We all know, I said it before, 75 to 80% of the population will be living in urban space by the end of this century. So population clusters and urban centers. So this concept of an urbanized population, which is the percentage of a country's people living in cities, is very important. Cities are interdependent with other cities and towns. That's central place. There's this notion of urban primacy, especially in developing nations. Urban primacy produces what we call primate centers. Those are cities that are inordinately large compared to other cities in the country. Mexico City is a primate city. Lima, Peru, primate city. They're inordinately large, and a large percentage of the population lives there. This is an urban model from Latin American city. Urban geographers like to define their world and compartmentalize it. So you can see a central business district here, a spine that runs out to a commercial area mall. The periférico is the bypass around it. And in the central business district, there might have been a market. There's generally an industrial park. This could go in any cardinal direction. And I put some photos of Mexico City in here so you could see where all this might end up. So in Latin America, sometimes the poor live outside on the periphery, and other times they live inside. This compares the city of Merida in the Yucatan of Mexico with this model. The only change you have to make to this model is to flip it up to where the mall's at the north and the industrial park's at the south. The Periférico goes around there. You can slightly see it in this Landsat thematic map or image. Here's the airport, central business district, which started as a mercado. And I would note that this is a grid-like pattern. Grid-like pattern is associated with European colonial powers. The colonizers, originally the indigenous folks of this area, the Maya, would have had what we call an organic street pattern, which follows the natural terrain of the land, is not gridded out. Over-urbanization is high population growth, and it tests the infrastructure and services that can't grow as fast as the population. Occurs in developing countries in primate cities where folks leave their ability to take care of themselves, to feed themselves, to provide shelter, to provide clothing for the hopes of getting a job and becoming so-called middle class in the cities. When they get there, they find there are no jobs. They don't have the skills. And what we find is squatter settlements like this particular photo shows here. So you can see the growth over urbanization, if you will, of areas. There's Lagos, Mumbai, Cairo, all in developing countries. Cultural coherence and diversity. We're going to stop there for a moment.